All right. Well, good morning, fourth grade. Good morning, Neil Cummins, and happy first day of remote online learning. This is Mr. Christofferson here, and I'm going to be putting together some videos each day that will help us with our fraction unit that we're going to be starting. So, this is new for me. It's new for you. We're going to figure out this video thing together, and we're going to start off simple here, really get down to the basics of a fraction. And if you think back to third grade, I know you learned about fractions and learned about some of these vocabulary words like a numerator and a denominator. But we want to make sure that we're starting off on a good note and really make sure we have a clear definition of what a fraction is. And when we hear the word numerator and we hear the word denominator, we know what those mean. So one really, really important idea of a fraction is that it's expressing equal parts of a whole. So if I want to think about how I'm going to be breaking up a pizza or a pie or any sort of object, we really want to make sure that they are equal parts of a whole. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later in this lesson. Two other words that we're going to be using quite often are the numerator, and that would be thought of as the number on top of our fraction line or our fraction bar. And the way that my brain works is I always think about how many parts do I have, right? How many parts are shaded in? And we also have the denominator, right? And we're thinking about how many parts the whole is divided into. So thinking about our numerator and our denominator and thinking about fractions in equal parts, here we have a couple of different fraction models that are outlined. And we can see a numerator and we can see a denominator. And on these fraction strips, our fraction bar is written diagonally, kind of going from corner to corner here, which is another totally acceptable way of writing fractions. And as you can see, starting down on this bottom row, we have equal parts, so each of these pieces are the same size. And in this case, it has been split into 6 parts, so we would say that each part represents 1/6. So I have 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, and 1/6. And if we put that together, we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sixths. And we can see that 6/6 is taking up the same amount of space as the 5/5. It's taking up the same amount of space as 4/4. It's taking the same amount of space as 1, 2, 3 thirds, halves, and 1 whole. And that's going to be something that we see on our math assignment today, which would be practicing how to write fractions. So this is going to be your in-class work or your at-home work, where we're going to be starting off with just practicing naming a fraction. How many of the pieces are shaded in out of how many of the pieces all together. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later. But we want to take a closer look at fractions and what it means to write a fraction. And to do this, I'm going to be playing a little game, and it's going to be involving pennies. So as you saw with this fraction model a moment ago, the size of the whole is not changing, but the amount of pieces that it's cut into can change. So when I'm changing my denominator here, or thinking about how many pieces the whole is cut into, I'm going to be thinking about how many pennies I'm using. So for this case, you can see that I have 2 pennies here, which means that my whole will be broken into 2 pieces. Now, one thing that I want to demonstrate, or I want to just show, is how we can think about the number on top, right? How many pieces do we have? So for this activity, I'm going to be looking at how many of these pennies are heads up and how many of them are tails. Okay, so what I'm representing with this fraction here is I have 1 out of my 2 pennies that has heads up, and then the other one would be tails. So if we think about drawing this fraction, I'm going to start with just any old rectangle, and that's going to represent my whole. Again, oftentimes when we're working with fractions, we think of a whole pizza, a whole pie, whatever it may be. So in this case, I'm going to have my 2 pennies, right? And so because I'm just dealing with 2 pennies for this first example, it's telling me that my fraction is split into two pieces. And actually, I made a little mistake there. I'm going to go back and I'm going to use a purple just so it matches up with this bottom number here. So I've split my whole pizza, whole pie, whatever it is that we're talking about, into 2 pieces. And if I'm curious about how many of those pieces have heads and how many of them are tails, in this model here, 1 out of my 2 pieces had the heads facing up. And I'm using blue because that's going to match our numerator, thinking about how many pieces we have or how many pieces are shaded in. So this fraction can be read as 1/2, where we have 1 out of the 2 pennies is heads up. I'm going to do another example of that here in just a moment. But I'm going to erase, and I'm going to introduce a couple of new pennies. So now I'm going to be changing the size. Oh, I misspoke there. I'm going to be changing how many pieces my whole is cut into, okay? So I can still keep that same rectangle, but this time I'm going to be cutting the whole into 4 pieces. Okay, 4 pieces. And thinking back to our definition is we want to be making sure that we're breaking these pieces into 4 equal parts. So if I were to take away those lines here, it wouldn't be fair if I were to cut them into 4 pieces like this, because that would not be representing 4 equal parts. So we're going to start fresh. We'll break it into 4 equal parts. And again, I'm going to use that purple to match the number on the denominator. So I'm starting with 4 pieces. And I'm going to do my best to make them equal. Since I'm not using a ruler and I'm not measuring, we'll have to just assume that that's as good as I can get there. And for this activity, I'm going to take those pennies again, and I'm just going to kind of toss them in the air, sprinkle them down, and I'm going to take a moment to look at how many landed heads up and how many of them have tails facing up. So in this situation, I have 1 penny that landed heads up. I had a 2nd penny that landed heads up, and these 2 were tails. So if I'm thinking about how many out of my whole, thinking about that, how many parts do I have or how many of them are shaded in this situation, I had 2 pennies that were heads up out of the 4 total. So I would represent this fraction by having a 2 in the numerator and a 4 in the denominator. So I would say that this fraction is 2/4. I'm going to take a moment to put these pennies off to the side and show you what that might look like using these fraction strips. So right away, my eye looks at this yellow row because I had split it into 4 pieces, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4 fraction strips. And out of those 4 pieces, I could say that 2 were heads up. And we'll do one more practice here. I'm going to erase. And I'm going to increase the amount of pieces or the amount of pennies that I'm going to use in this model. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to reintroduce that black rectangle that represents one whole. And I'm going to split this fraction, or this whole, into 6 equal parts. And if you notice, I've kind of changed the way that I've split up the whole. And we as mathematicians get to kind of have that freedom in how we want to represent, or how we want to split our whole up. Sometimes we can use just vertical lines. Sometimes we can use horizontal lines. Or in this case, I'm using both vertical and horizontal lines. Keeping in mind, though, I'm doing my best to represent 6 equal parts. Okay. One piece of advice that I've seen through my years of teaching 4th grade is students have way more success when we draw a rectangle to represent a whole. It's a little bit easier to split it into 6 equal pieces. Oftentimes when we think of pizzas and pies, we draw circles. And time again, I see a student go like this. So I've split it into 2 pieces. I've split it into 4 pieces. I've split it into 6 pieces. But the problem with this is we're not having 6 equal pieces. If this was a piece of birthday cake, I would feel really lucky if I got this piece or this piece, because those are a larger piece of the cake. These 4 are slightly smaller. So we want to make sure we're being thoughtful in how we break up, or how we partition or section off our 6 equal pieces. So again, here are my 6 pennies. I'm going to shuffle them up, shake them around, and start to drop them on the paper here. We have 1, 2, 3 that were heads, and we have 3 that were tails. So I know that my numerators, how many pieces were shaded in. There was 1, 2, 3. And the total amount of pieces that this whole was cut into was 6 total pieces. I'm going to take a moment to check in on a different representation of fractions and going back to my fraction strips. And again, my eye is going down to this bottom row where it is split into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 total pieces. And in this case, I had 3 pennies that were heads up, and I had 3 pennies that were tails up. Now, in this exercise, I was just looking at how many fractions, or how many pennies were heads up, so I could say that 3 out of the 6 total pieces were heads up. So that would be 3/6. And some of you mathematicians might be noticing that 3/6 is taking up the same amount of space as 2/4, and it's also equivalent or equal or taking up the same amount of space as 1/2. And that's going to be a concept that we come back to a little bit later in the week. So, as always, we want to make sure we're being healthy, smart, a little bit of hand sanitizer there, making sure that we're staying clean and healthy even at remote online learning. Your teachers have posted in Google Classroom or an email what your assignment is, but today we're going to be looking at how many pieces are shaded in as our numerator out of how many pieces there are total. That would be the denominator. Feel free to reach out to us between 10 a.m. and noon with office hour questions, and hope you guys are enjoying yourselves, remembering to breathe, remembering to smile, and have fun in this difficult time. So take care, and the 4th grade team misses you all.